Hi, I'm Paul Guppy. I am Senior Researcher for the Washington Policy Center, and this is our regular weekly update on the topics and issues that we are working on, and also what we see coming up in the next couple of weeks and months regarding those who govern our state and what ideas they have in mind about passing new laws, new regulations that will impact our lives in the coming year and will affect literally everybody in the state. So we're keeping a close eye on what's coming up in Olympia. What's happening in this season, of course, is planning for the next legislative session. The legislature will come into session on January 13th. They are planning a 105-day session, which is considered a quote long session. And the reason for that is their primary job is to enact a new 2-year budget for the state. And the state's next fiscal cycle begins on July 1st of 2025. And so early in the year, the legislature's job, and then our new governor, newly elected Bob Ferguson, is to negotiate that budget and then get it passed by late March, early April. And so if everything goes according to plan, a new budget will be in place. The framing of that budget, however, is the current controversy. So the outgoing governor, Jay Inslee, is required to submit a balanced budget to the legislature. He has done that a little bit earlier in December, and no surprise, it is an overspending budget. So the governor has announced that the state faces a $10 to $12 billion shortfall for the next 4-year outlook, is the way they estimate the budget. And he's required to introduce a budget that will be balanced. So he is crying panic. What we are working on, that is our top issue, is the budget going into the legislative session, and for the following reason, that the standard way of talking about public finance in government is to say there's a shortfall, there's a cut, there's a deficit. And we look at that from an independent, common sense point of view, and that is simply not the case. The people in our state work hard, tax revenues are up, and there is no deficit, cut, shortfall, gap. You're going to hear this kind of language all the time. And in the real world where the rest of us live, that is not actually happening. However, people in government have an incentive to create a sense of panic with the public because that softens up the resistance to passing a tax increase. And Democrat leaders have already talked about the new taxes that they want to pass, and I'll get to those in a minute. Our primary focus is messaging and framing in order to inform the public about what's really going on with the deficit. With the budget. The current budget is $72 billion for the general operating fund. That is more than enough to run current services, and the legislature has already received estimates that revenues are going to increase. So where does the gap come from? And the answer is policy decisions that Governor Inslee made that lock in increases in the future. So there's a little bit about how politicians talk about the budget. For most of us, if we in our households receive, for example, an 8% raise in income and we expected a 10%, we would still say, that's good news, great. We have more revenue, we have a higher household income. In government circles, that same scenario would be called a 2% cut. So if they don't get the money they're expecting, they claim that they're being shorted and they're going to have to cut government services. Inslee has already pursued this tactic when he made his budget announcement a few weeks ago. And what was the first thing he said? If we don't get a tax increase, we're going to cut mental health services for children. And he uses passive language, acting as if this is not under his control. He's not accountable. It's just going to happen. And we are all about accountability of our elected officials in government. So we did a little digging to see where did this overspending come from. Big surprise, didn't happen by itself. It was Governor Inslee himself made policy decisions that created this, what he calls a shortfall. And I'll give 2 examples. On March 29th, earlier in this year, he signed a supplemental budget beyond what had already been planned. He added, kind of midterm, another $2 billion in permanent government spending. That gets built into the budget estimates in the future. The second thing he did over the summer was secretly negotiate pay raises for all public sector workers. This makes sense for him. Public sector unions are a major part of his political base. They help Democrats get elected in this state. Where do the unions' financial benefits come from? They come out of the Treasury. So negotiating a $1.3 billion pay raise and increasing union dues, increase in health benefits for public sector workers makes perfect sense for Inslee. However, he doesn't want to exactly announce that to the rest of the state. So these talks were held in secret. And then the resulting agreement, collective bargaining agreement, it's called, was announced when all those negotiations were done. That package with the price tag now goes to the legislature, and lawmakers will be expected to approve it sometime in January or February. So those are two examples of where the overspending comes from. What we want to push back about against with facts and data at Washington Policy Center is to show that this false choice and even threats of cutting basic social services coming out of Olympia are just not viable. And there's no reason to scare people into thinking that if we don't accept tax increases, then terrible, horrible things are going to happen to people around the state. We've seen this movie before. Those of us who work in public finance are very familiar with this narrative. And guess what? It never happens. On a practical basis, there are other ways to go. I mentioned two items that the legislature could roll back: the extra $2 billion in spending. No reason to keep repeating that indefinitely into the future. And they could also take a look at $1.3 billion in automatic pay raises for the public sector. Workforce retention in the public sector for the state is over 90%. So they're not losing workers. They don't have to pay big incentives to keep people on board. Why the big pay raises? The rest of us don't get an automatic pay raise. But let me add one more thing. If the governor, whether it's outgoing Jay Inslee or incoming Bob Ferguson, if you're really looking for ways to balance the budget, to save money and make government more efficient, guess what? I have a resource right here from the Washington Policy Center. Dozens and dozens of recommendations that would make our government work better. And not a single one of these ideas involves increasing the financial burden of the people of our state. So I mentioned that the governor is proposing some tax increases, and I'll just run through a few of those. He wants an increase in the B&O tax. The main one, and the Democrats are looking at removing popular property tax limitations. They claim that that's not a vote to raise taxes, it's just removing a cap. Well, what's the purpose of removing a 1% cap on property tax collections if you don't plan on raising property taxes above that 1%? And the other, what we consider nefarious idea that the governor is proposing is a wealth tax. And this is a ethically questionable idea. As far as we know, it's never happened in Washington state. And what the Inslee is proposing is that there would be a 1% tax on a targeted few thousand people who would have 3,400 people who would have to pay this wealth tax, not based on income that they earned, but simply based on the government's estimate of what they are worth. And like the capital gains income tax, he's starting this as a tax on the rich, only targeting the highest. But it's the principle of the thing that is really a problem. When the government decides you owe X amount of taxes based on money that you don't even have, just what they consider you to be worth, is a bad precedent to be established in our state. You put all this together and then you scratch your head and say, like, well, why do elected officials think that they don't have credibility, that the public doesn't trust them? And it's because of ideas like that. People quickly figure out that either the tax code is not fair, that the story they're being told about the so-called budget deficit is not true. Tax revenues are increasing. And then I've heard complaints from people in the public sector, particularly politicians, who are like, why is our reputation so bad? Why don't people believe us when we tell them these narratives? And what Jay Inslee and incoming Bob Ferguson are doing explains a lot of why the public's respect and standing for people in government, it gets to be so low. So with that, we've had some very good media coverage on the work that we're doing, and the session hasn't even started yet. Como News did an evening news segment on the budget that included our views and our framing. And we were very encouraged that our meeting with the Seattle Times editorial board went very well. And on December 15th, the Seattle Times put out an editorial about the budget, again, including this question of, if revenues are rising, why do they say that they need a tax increase? So we think that is good setup for going into January, and we'll see how the debate plays out. Other than that, we are keeping our eyes open for bad bills that might return from the last session, and I'll just mention a few quick examples. One is there was a Democrat bill proposed early last year to keep Donald Trump's name from appearing on the Washington state ballot. That bill was not successful, fortunately, and voters in Washington were able to participate in the national presidential election just like every other state. However, we know that this sets a precedent for us to watch out for in terms of protecting our democracy of legislation which is introduced that targets particular candidates, gives the name of someone who's not allowed to appear on the ballot, and that's something we're going to watch out for. Also going forward is there was a bill to impose statewide rent control. It failed, but we think that idea is probably going to come back. There was a proposal to create a guaranteed government income program. This is something we've researched the background of. Uh, 6 jurisdictions have tried this idea in the past, including the city of Tacoma. The idea has been proposed in the city of Seattle. It has failed every single time. The idea that was proposed in Washington state last year is that 7,500 low-income people would be selected by the government and they would receive automatic cash payments every month for up to 2 years. The left calls this a basic income program or a guaranteed income program, but what it really is a loss of independence program. The purpose of guaranteed basic income is to get people used to the idea that their income comes from the government and that they are not able to operate independently. For people in government, that serves their purposes very well. I mean, we saw a lot of this same policies during COVID, which is how can they exercise control over your life? So we'll watch out for a guaranteed basic income bill that might be introduced again this year. Also, I mentioned protecting popular property tax limits. We will be doing that. We are going to protect the supermajority on passing long-term school bonds. Right now, that threshold is 60% of voters in the local area have to agree to take on more debt. There was a Democrat bill to cut that to 55% or 50%. We think that taxpayer protection is needed before decades of debt are put on future taxpayers who didn't even get a chance to vote on the first levy. Also, we are seeing more and more push, I call it a campaign, on the part of different segments of the government and interest groups to push for a mileage tax. They call it a road usage charge or a road usage fee. And you see that they're trying to adopt marketing labeling to make this sound like it's an acceptable idea. But bottom line is it's an odometer tax on your vehicle that would have some kind of mechanism like a GPS tracker to not only record how much you drive, but that you would have to pay on each mile you drive. This is a highly unpopular idea, as you would expect. However, there is a consistent push and campaign from the Department of Transportation, interest groups, and even some lawmakers who very badly want this new source of revenue. They just have to overcome the resistance of the public, that's all. And so that's why expect to hear what is virtually a marketing campaign from the government sector to try to get people to accept a road usage charge, a mileage tax. And with that, I'll wrap up on issues and mention some of our events that we have coming up. Our very successful and popular Young Professionals program has a membership benefits seminar. This will be online, and that's on January 15th. And then, of course, as our supporters know, every January we hold a legislative reception in Olympia. This year, that is, or starting next year, that is planned for January 22nd. It will be held right near the Capitol campus. It's bipartisan, and we often get great attendance from both staff and members at that, and that will be an exciting event as well. And with that, in this holiday season, we at Washington Policy Center would like to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and have a great New Year, and we will be back at it in January. Thanks.